Hey again, everyone. Alexander here for 30 Days of Symphony. Well, we've been having a rich and rare experience, courtesy of the alphabet, surveying much of the glory of the 19th century symphony in Central Europe, in Austria and Germany, courtesy of Beethoven and Brahms and, lastly, Anton Bruckner. But you may be wondering that if generally speaking, in the 19th century in Europe is this, how does one say, this cornucopia of great, glorious symphonies, that you may be wondering, surely there were other composers who were writing great symphonies in the middle and later 19th century. Well, the answer to that is yes and no, because while there were many symphonies written over the course of the 19th century in places like France and Germany and Austria and what is now the Czech Republic, all over Europe, very few of them have, it must be said, stood the test of time. There's a particular statistic that we've referred to in the sphere of musicology. There was a great German musicologist, or that's a fancy name for historian of classical music, a great German musicologist named Karl Dahlhaus. And there was this turn of phrase we all heard about called the Dahlhaus Gap. Kind of sounds like the Brenner Pass. What it is this rather strange but fascinating little factoid that from 1851, when Robert Schumann, you remember Johannes Brahms's tortured mentor, from 1851, when Robert Schumann wrote his last symphony, his Symphony No. 4, to 1876, when we saw the premiere of the Brahms Symphony No. 1, there is literally this 25-year gap. Imagine an entire quarter century, a full quarter of the 19th century, this century we really see as the center of our orchestral repertoire, an entire gap of a quarter century when no great symphonies were composed. In fact, just in general, very few symphonies, great, good, bad, or indifferent, were composed. Actually, if you looked at the records of music publishers in Paris and Berlin and Munich and Vienna, actually very few people were writing symphonies because they had seen how Felix Mendelssohn and Robert Schumann had kind of literally gone to their early graves trying, I mean, you have to feel sorry for them, just desperately trying to live up to the standards set by Beethoven and Schubert. Schumann and Mendelssohn, in very different ways, kind of meet their untimely deaths. Schumann loses his mind. Mendelssohn, literally works himself to death. So there is this truly like this 25-year gap, a kind of a lost generation in European classical music when no great symphonies were written. That is generally true, but like all generalizations, there are exceptions, a handful of great exceptions. And the greatest of those great exceptions I want to share with you now. It is the Symphony No. 2 in F minor, that very dark, that kind of gunmetal gray of a key signature, 4 flats. The Symphony No. 2 in F minor from the year 1870 by Max Bruch, B-R-U-C-H. Now, you know Max Bruch because Max Bruch wrote 3 incredibly famous and beloved and deservedly often played works for solo string instrument and orchestra. He wrote that gorgeous first violin concerto, the violin concerto in G minor. He actually wrote 3 of them. The other 2 are quite good, but they're never played. But the deservedly famous violin concerto in G minor, referred to in the business as simply as Bruch G minor. And again, there's a reason why it's played all the time. It's kind of like the reason why Beethoven Fifth Symphony is played all the time. It never gets stale. Excuse me. And the other just eternally, deservedly famous work for violin and orchestra was, of course, a piece that means a lot to me, the Scottish Fantasy, which is kind of a violin concerto in all but name. It's like his fourth violin concerto, if you will, that I actually had the privilege of recording with Rachel Barton Pine, our great American violinist who, like me, resides most of the year in Chicago. And in 2000, it was 2004, 2005, we made that, I must say, if I do say so myself, that quite famous recording with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra in the Usher Hall in Edinburgh. And it still gets played. I hear it as I'm driving across the country. I still hear it now and then played on radio stations. That gorgeous piece based on Scottish folk tunes for violin and orchestra that was premiered by Pablo de Sarasate. And of course, the third of this kind of triptych of incredibly and deservedly famous works for solo instrument and orchestra is his work for cello and orchestra, the Kol Nidre, which is his setting of one of the great chant tunes from the Jewish Yom Kippur service. And it's funny because Bruch tended to write music based on other nationalities. He himself was a typical kind of North German, late 19th century, like Brahms, a very professorial kind of musician, but he wrote these very famous sets of Swedish dances. So people thought he was Swedish, and because of the Kol Nidre, everyone thought he was a German Jewish composer. And then because of the Scottish Fantasy, Max Bruch, top of the morning to you, everyone thought he was Scottish. So, but he was, like Brahms, a kind of very typical, very professorial North German academic composer. Excuse me. Unlike Brahms, though, Bruch had a wife and children he had to support. And so he actually spent the bulk of his time through his very long life. He was born in the 1830s and died in 1920. Over the course of his very long life, unlike Brahms, who simply kind of wrote music for publication, Bruch spent a lot of his time teaching music at the Prussian Academy of Art in Berlin, and then also was very, very busy as a conductor in the 1880s, actually. He was the music director of one of the great British orchestras, the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. So Bruch just didn't write quite as much in the symphonic realm as Brahms did, but he did leave 3 symphonies. And I must say that I know this is the most overused phrase in the world, but the second of his 3 symphonies is truly a forgotten masterpiece. It really is the missing link between the world of Schumann and Mendelssohn in the 1830s and 40s and early 1850s, and then the ascent of Brahms in the 1870s. It really is the one symphony from that, as I said, that dollhouse gap, that 25-year period from 1851 to 1876. It really is a symphony worthy to be considered alongside the famous ones that we've already been discussing. It's funny, people always say, well, people who are detractors of Max Bruch, and those people I feel sorry for because they're missing out, they always say that Max Bruch is like something, it's warmed over Mendelssohn. Like the best they could say about Max Bruch's music is, well, if Mendelssohn had lived a long and fruitful life into the late 19th century, Max Bruch's music is what his music would have sounded like. Well, first of all, we'll never know. We'll never know if that's true. Hate to break the news to you, but secondly, Max Bruch was his own man as a composer, and his voice is profoundly influenced by that winsome German early romanticism of the 1830s and 40s. But this piece is completely original and distinctive. It is a symphony, again, in this rather strange key for a symphony. I'm thinking there are a couple of Haydn, middle period Joseph Haydn symphonies in F minor, and the only other famous symphony in F minor is one of the most tragic symphonies ever written, the 4th Symphony by Tchaikovsky, that we'll get to later. Excuse me. But so it's this very gray, it's like the grayest of keys. And out of that gray, it's like, you have to look at certain Romantic era symphonies like they're oil paintings. And out of that gray palette, Bruch just amazingly brings out other colors, reds, yellows and greens and oranges, and this is a work of great fire and passion, but it does have a great link with Schumann and Mendelssohn in its archingly long melodic lines. Bruch would not pretend to be quite the genius that Brahms was, and again in that style of developing variation like that Brahms so masterly displayed, where, I mean, it's something really he himself, that was original to him, where he's constantly, from the moment he introduces a musical theme, he's developing it. Bruch is a little more relaxed, but if you listen through the development section, the middle section of the first movement, there are these moments of development of his material, these moments of lyric genius that I think Brahms, in his more humble moments, would have envied. This is a symphony in 3 movements, not the usual 4 movements, but 3. There is no scherzo movement, my friends. There is no symphonic dance. And that is the key, I think, to the genius of this work. It's about 35 minutes in length, rather concise as late Romantic symphonies go. Because if you listen carefully, these beautiful 3 movements tend to grow one out of the one preceding. The greatest of all moments in this regard is the segue from the second movement to the third movement. Bruch, I think he does here follow in the tradition of Felix Mendelssohn, and that, you know how, and we'll get to Mendelssohn's symphonies later, but Mendelssohn in his greatest symphonies, like the Scottish Symphony, wants one movement to flow into the next, which in the 1830s and 40s was an innovation. Bruch does this as well, but when you sense the second movement, this very tragic slow movement, but with this radiant light. There's this, again, I always allude to painting when I think of these kind of symphonies. There is this radiance that comes, this kind of very burnished, it's like an oil lamp that you've been rubbing, that you get this light from it. There is this burnished radiance that comes out of this slow movement that then just naturally, effortlessly segues into the finale. And I mean, what makes it a moment of genius is not only is the main melody of the finale just gorgeously beautiful. Bruch just knew how to spin a line in a way that very few composers do. But it just, thematically, it just grows, again, effortlessly out of the material of the slow movement that came just before. People occasionally ask me at parties and receptions, though, someone will take me aside and they'll just go, what is it about classical music? What makes it great? What makes it so great? And they want to know, they're asking, and I try to find a way of saying that, well, the greatness of classical music is that it comes out of this tradition that goes over now, over 1,000 years. But within the tradition, it's always trying to move forward. Even the least little bit, just the slightest bit, it's always trying to move forward. And this is what Max Bruch was doing. And this is the key to what makes this symphony beautiful, what makes this second symphony of Max Bruch a forgotten masterpiece. Bruch was a small c conservative. He has no interest whatsoever in the radical, theatrical, philosophical, political, innovations, if that's the right word, of a Richard Wagner. He has no interest also in the different, but in their own way equally radical, developing variation techniques of a Johannes Brahms. He just has his own style and he wants to stick to it. And that's exactly what he stuck to for the rest of his life. And what's rather extraordinary is that Max Bruch in his final years, as he lived through, seeing Germany be defeated in World War I and losing his son, and his son died in World War I. And he's basically in 1918 and 1919, he's basically writing the same music he was writing in the 1850s and 60s. But that's what he wanted. That was his voice. So in this 3-movement symphony, this very organic 3-movement symphony, I hope you'll agree with me that this was a conservative, a traditionalist voice, but the voice of a composer who truly had something to say. This really is one of my very favorite symphonies, and I hope someday I can conduct it for you all in La Crosse. But between now and then, this great recording by a great German orchestra of truly a forgotten masterpiece, the Second Symphony in F minor by Max Bruch.